U.S. Naval War College is the Navy's home of thought. Established in 1884, NWC has become the center of naval sea power, both strategically and intellectually. The following Issues in National Security lecture is specifically designed to offer scholarly lectures to all participants. We hope you enjoy this upcoming discussion and future lectures.
Good afternoon and welcome to our fifth Issues in National Security lecture for this academic year. I'm John Jackson and it's my pleasure to be host for today's event. I'd like to note that we're gathered here together in person and we also have a large audience dialed in via Zoom. Over the 24-25 academic year, we're offering 10 lectures from some of the best scholars in the world, our resident faculty. This effort is intended to share a portion of the Naval War College's academic experience with the spouses and significant others of our student body. We also welcome participation by the entire Naval War College extended family, including members of the Naval War College Foundation, international sponsors, civilian employees, colleagues throughout Naval Station Newport, and others around the globe. While the primary purpose is to share information and learn together, we do offer documentation in the form of certificates of completion to all participants who attend at least 70% of the offered lectures. You can participate here in the audience via Zoom or even by watching the lectures when they're posted on YouTube. It's interesting to note our third session that was done in this series on China has had over 14,000 views on YouTube. So this process has a pretty big reach around the world. We ask you to keep track of how you participate, and we'll ask you to self-certify at the end of the series, and we'll get your certificates out to you. While we normally offer lectures about 2 weeks apart, we're accommodating other college schedules by offering our sixth lecture next week on 18 March of 2025, and we will host Professor Jim Holmes' lecture, What Would Nelson Say? A look at maritime operations in the Pacific, both in history and looking to the future. This will happen here in Spruance Auditorium at the normal time next week. Okay, on with the main event. At the conclusion of the presentation that follows, we'll welcome questions from our audience. Please use the microphones located at each seat so all of us and our virtual participants can hear the questions. Let's move on to the educational point of today's event. Space is becoming an increasingly important part of national security. Today's lecture will survey how space has factored into U.S. naval security from the days of Sputnik to the era of great power competition. The presentation will describe potential challenges to American space security, how the U.S. has been responding to them, and consider possible new directions for U.S. space policy in the Trump administration. This is a great week to be talking about space. Last week, SpaceX's second consecutive Starship was destroyed in flight, and we believe that astronauts Sonny Williams and Butch Wilmore will likely make their long-delayed return to Earth as early as next week. So there's lots going on above us. Dr. David Burbach is the Associate Professor in the National Security Affairs Department here at the Naval War College, and he is Director of the college's Space Studies Group. His professional interests include the intersection of international relations and technology, including space, nuclear, and cyber issues, as well as civil-military relations. He has previously taught at the Army School of Advanced Military Studies and has worked for several information technology organizations. He earned a PhD in political science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Please join me in welcoming Professor Burbach.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for those of you who have joined us here in the auditorium today. Welcome to those of you who are watching us live on the internet. And I will send a message out into the future and welcome those of you who may be watching this online sometime in the future. I'm Professor David Burbach, and for this afternoon, I will be taking you on a brief tour through how space has contributed to U.S. national security over the years, through the Cold War, through some of the ways that we use space today in both our civilian and military endeavors, some of the challenges that we face in this era of great power competition, a little bit about how we are responding, both ways, strategic concepts we're using, as well as a little about the U.S. Space Force and what that has meant, and again, some considerations about some changes that may be on the way with the new administration. I'll start though noting, we often think about space as something new, something different, but I'll note it's been around a long time. If Sputnik were still around, it would be more than old enough to collect Social Security, to retire. We've been using space for nearly 70 years now, since 1957. So this is, in some ways, this is really not a new domain, but there are ways that it's changing, that some of the ways we use it and some of the challenges that we face have been evolving. So I'll spend a bit of time talking about them, but first let me take you back to those heady days of the space race and what we got out of space in the Cold War. And what you're probably most familiar with, images that any American, anyone in the world can probably conjure up pretty quickly, was that exciting space race where the Soviets and the Americans both tried to use space to project national prestige, to demonstrate to the world their technical capabilities, to show the world that their system was the one that was going to own the future. You can see on the images behind me a propaganda photo of the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin from the Soviet Union. Our first man to orbit the Earth, John Glenn, is not in the photo, but we actually sent his space capsule on a world tour. We sent it around the world. Its fourth orbit, we called it. And there were long lines all over the world for people wanting to see this thing that had been in space. And kind of capturing the sentiment at the time, the political cartoon might be a little hard to read. It shows an Uncle Sam, with a sad bouquet of flowers and some chocolates, hoping to, woo a pretty woman, with Nikita Khrushchev pointing, saying, only I can give you a moon. And that really captures that we felt at this time when decolonization was happening. There were new nations all over the world deciding who they would be aligning with. And we felt that space accomplishments were going to be an important thing that countries would look at. Who was going to own the future? And we got off to a bit of a rough start with Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin catching the lead. But it wasn't very long before we caught up. And John F. Kennedy said the ultimate test was going to be who could put a man on the moon and return them safely to Earth. And in 1969, we accomplished that. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon. And it's amazing in retrospect, especially given how new mass communications were at the time, what an event it was. Something like 1 out of every 6 people on planet Earth watched the event on live television. In fact, we even helped some countries build out their television networks so that they would be able to watch this American accomplishment happen. It was no coincidence that this was the biggest media event ever. The US really had a whole of government approach to promote this, to send a message that, as our astronauts said, that they came in peace for all mankind. We even briefly considered putting a UN flag on the moon instead of a US flag. The US Congress made pretty clear that if NASA wanted any funding, it was going to be a US flag. But we really consciously thought, this act speaks for itself. We don't need to beat our chests and go, USA, USA. The world knows what's happening. So, within a decade, we had demonstrated that we could do some pretty amazing things in space. But that wasn't all that we did in space. In fact, in some ways, it wasn't even the most important, because throughout the same period and continuing all throughout the Cold War, the quieter but at least as important aspect of space was spying. We considered space to be absolutely essential to see what was going on in the Soviet Union. The image I've got there is not a Cold War example. That's actually from a US commercial company. I'm sure there are even better photos on a classified basis that I'm obviously not going to show in this unclassified setting. But the commercial firm Maxar photographed a Chinese mock-up of a US aircraft carrier out in their desert, presumably as a target for testing their own missiles. This is routine for us today. We see stuff all over, but put yourself in the minds of, say, the Eisenhower administration in the 1950s, where the Soviet Union was a tremendously closed society. The map that I show here is from the Germans when they invaded the Soviet Union. We actually made use of captured German maps because the Soviets made it so difficult to even know where cities or major roads were located that was the best we could do. We didn't know where their industry was. We didn't know how many nuclear missiles they had, what their nuclear capabilities were. We really were operating in the dark against a country that we were afraid might launch a surprise attack against us. And so even before John Glenn had gone into orbit, before Sputnik had been launched, the Eisenhower administration had already identified spy satellites, surveillance satellites, as a #1 national priority. We didn't talk about it in public, but we already had programs well underway such that by 1959, 2 years after Sputnik, we already had the first test satellites up, the Corona satellite from the CIA, taking photos. Now, back in those days, it couldn't digitally transmit photos back. Believe it or not, the film would be in capsules that would be ejected from the satellite, re-enter on their own, fall down on a parachute, and an Air Force plane would grab the parachute in midair, rush the film back to Washington, D.C., and develop it. Now, it meant you weren't going to get real-time images. It's a pretty cool that we worked out how to do that. But we did what we needed to do because we wanted to know what exactly did we face? What kind of threats were we facing? We built even larger spy satellites that had multiple film cameras. The image that you see there is from the early Reagan administration showing a Soviet nuclear missile submarine under construction. So we pretty quickly were able to establish a real ability to see what the other side was up to. And there's a good quote from President Lyndon Johnson. Particularly like the quote because he starts out saying, I don't want to be quoted on this, but he was giving it to a bunch of newspaper reporters, where he says, all that we're doing in space would be worth it 10 times over just for the photography that we're getting. Because Johnson knows how many missiles the enemy has. And before spy satellites, we didn't know. We thought the Soviets, we figured out pretty quickly, we thought the Soviets were building far more bombers than they actually were, that they were building far more intercontinental ballistic missiles than they were. We assumed that they were building more missiles than we thought. We worried greatly that they might be ready to launch a surprise attack on a moment's notice. And as Johnson notes, we actually were able to sleep better at night. And perhaps more practically, we didn't need to spend as much money on our own missiles to match what the Soviets were doing. So this was a tremendous relief to presidents to know throughout the Cold War what the other side was up to. And we also very quickly worked on some of the same capabilities that you're familiar with today. Beyond spy satellites, we had the very first navigational satellites for the Navy by the mid-1960s. Not as convenient as your GPS on your phone, but it was better than trying to use a sextant on a cloudy day. We pretty quickly had weather satellites. We had communication satellites. Very importantly, we developed satellites that would be able to monitor adversary missile launches. So, because if you think about that generation, they were haunted by Pearl Harbor. And the thought that a nuclear Pearl Harbor could happen was tremendously worrying. Space gave us the ability to be able to see adversary missiles being launched as soon as they were out of their silos, so that we at least would have enough warning, to know an attack was underway and start some responses. One thing that we didn't do during the Cold War and still haven't done is use space as a base for weapons to attack the Earth. And it might seem like a natural thing, like, well, the high ground is always good. You want to always have your weapons on the high ground. So why don't we put weapons in space? Turns out it actually doesn't make as much practical sense when you start thinking about it. Both countries did, both the US and the Soviets considered putting nuclear weapons in orbit, and then they both thought better of it, because they started to do the logic like, well, how do you do maintenance on the nuclear weapon when it's in orbit? What if the other side sends up a satellite and puts a net around it and takes it home? What if it malfunctions and it comes down somewhere when we don't want it to come down? So both sides realized pretty quickly, you know what? Having nuclear weapons in a hole in the ground in your own territory, or safely on a nuclear submarine hidden in the ocean, actually makes a lot more sense. In fact, it made so much sense that we even agreed to a treaty mutually agreeing to not put weapons in space. Because both countries said, however bad an idea it is, if the other side does it, we'll do it too. Just because it's a bad idea won't stop us. So we did actually mutually figure that out. Some people suggest, you see the name rods from God. Imagine, if you will, something the size of a telephone pole made out of tungsten or some other heavy metal coming down at Mach 10 and slamming into your house or this building. That would hit pretty hard. It would be very much like getting hit with a pretty significant conventional bomb. And there have been proposals that, what if we put a lot of these, tungsten rods in orbit and brought them down on enemy positions. But again, when you really think it through, it's pretty expensive to do that. The energy it takes to put a lump of metal in space is pretty significant. It's actually pretty hard to aim it precisely as it's coming in on re-entry. And so we so far have mostly decided there's just not a big advantage to that. There are people who say, well, it would be like getting hit by a nuclear bomb. Not quite. If you actually do the energy calculation, one of these rods has about as much explosive power as if it were made out of TNT, which again, you wouldn't want to be where it hit, but that's not like a nuclear, you wouldn't destroy a city. So far, mostly we've concluded putting weapons in space to hit Earth does not make a lot of sense. Weapons to hit other things in space, I'll talk more about those in a few minutes. So kind of a summary of the strategic position that we found ourselves in the Cold War was we were relatively restrained. Now, in public, both sides, both the US and the Soviets, had these active programs with astronauts and waving the flag and doing cool stuff in space. Quietly, both sides saw space as absolutely essential for keeping tabs on what was going on in the world, and particularly keeping tabs on the other side's military. But we recognized that basing weapons in space was not going to be very useful. We even recognized that attacking each other's space-based observation capabilities might be destabilizing. Let's say the Soviets decided to attack one of those missile warning satellites that I described. Well, we would probably think, why would they attack the missile warning satellite if they weren't about to launch a first strike at us? And in fact, what if we want to try and manage a nuclear, maybe we want the Soviets to know if we're launching a big or a small attack. Both sides kind of figured it actually contributed to stability to have the other side have some ability to know what was going on, with nuclear readiness. So we mostly didn't make space a place where warfare happened. It was mostly where warfare was supported with communications and observations. So what's different today? We now, I said, are almost 70 years into the space age, and we've gone from an era when a few expensive satellites were used to support the most critical military technologies. Ballistic missile submarines would use those transit satellites to figure out where they were to be able to launch missiles accurately. Well, we're now at a place where we have a constellation of GPS satellites, and probably everybody in this room has, a receiver that relies on space-based signals from GPS or any of the other navigational constellations to know where you are. Space is in everything. It's in our everyday lives, and it's also become a critical part of everyday military operations. No longer just this reserve of, some specialized esoteric capabilities we would need when nuclear war happened, but bread and butter of what we do every day. And just to give some examples of how entwined space is with what we do, on the civilian side, again, we all understand navigation. I am old enough to have grown up using paper maps, so when they take GPS away, I actually still have a New England topographic atlas in the back seat of my car. I can flip through, and you may have kids, maybe yourselves, who've never really had to deal with a paper map and are gonna, would be lost without their GPS. This is just how we get, I don't ever use those maps anymore. It's so much easier with GPS. But beyond everyday navigation, obviously that's critical for, airline navigation. We have the technology now where, tractors or wheat harvesting combines use GPS signals to such precision that they know exactly where seeds were planted and can come back weeks later, put water or fertilizer exactly where those seeds were put down on a completely automated basis. Or GPS is going to be critical when we eventually get self-driving cars. But GPS is also critical for literally keeping the lights on or keeping the cell phone network working, where we get nanosecond accuracy timing signals from GPS that are used to synchronize the electrical grid, be able to keep track of data packets from your phone. Take away that GPS timing and our electrical and communications infrastructure is badly compromised. And you rely on weather forecasts from space. Some of you may get, if anybody still uses broadcast TV, you may have satellite TV. Your cell phone will soon be able to communicate directly to and from satellites. And you may wonder, what do satellites monitoring shopping mall parking lots? Yeah, actually, for businesses that want to keep track of is consumer spending going up or down, one of the things they'll do is purchase satellite imagery and be able to analyze how full are the shopping mall parking lots, or what stores are up and what stores are down, because we have that much data coming from space now. Or on the military side, wrong direction, on the military side, again, navigationally, pretty easy to understand. It allows us to go where we want, to send smart weapons against highly precise targets. As a global force, we need to communicate in austere locations where we may not have any other infrastructure. Space is critical to letting that happen. As we rely more and more on autonomous vehicles, space communication links, GPS, are even more important for being able to guide and communicate with them. We also do a tremendous amount of ISR, surveillance, intelligence, reconnaissance, to get targeting information from space so that we know where adversary forces are. We even are, if any of you are familiar with the JSTARS platform, the airborne moving target radar system we use to, way back in Desert Storm, you could see Iraqi tank columns or, whatever vehicles you want to identify. Our intent is to be able to use satellite constellations for that kind of information, to be able to identify moving airplanes or moving vehicles on the ground with space-based radar, so that we really can find anything on Earth at any time using that kind of capability. And of course, it's still critical to detect missile launches from space. And if we do, in fact, want to pursue a national missile defense, the Trump administration initially announced it would, calling it Iron Dome. I believe it turns out the Israeli company that makes that has actually trademarked the name Iron Dome. So we have now renamed it to Golden Dome. But if we do want to pursue a national missile defense, space is going to be absolutely essential, both for sensors and probably basing interceptors in space to be able to engage adversary missiles. So we need space. Of course, we do face competition, rivals, possibly adversaries. And unlike the adversaries that we faced between the end of the Cold War and the last decade or so, the Taliban, ISIS, even an enemy like Serbia or Iraq, we mostly had adversaries that had almost no space capability. Maybe they had satellite phones or handheld GPS receivers, but they certainly had no ability to interfere with our use of space. Well, that's different as we consider the possibility of Russia or China as adversaries, because they're both, capable space powers. I would still take US space capabilities over Russia or over China, but they are capable space powers, including having significant military counterspace capabilities. Counterspace meaning they have ways to take away our ability to use space for what we want to use it for. Weapons, jamming, a variety of ways that they can hurt us. And probably we're more vulnerable to this than they are. I use the asymmetric vulnerability. What do I mean by that? Two things. We, even though their military forces are pretty technically enabled, we use even more technology than they do. And probably we're the ones playing the away game. If you imagine a Taiwan or South China Sea contingency, that's going to be happening pretty close to China. Taiwan contingency would be close enough they could even use radio links from the Chinese mainland. We'd be operating half a world away. We would have to use space to be able to communicate, to be able to tell what's going on. Take that away, and it's probably a real disadvantage for the American way of fighting. And China and Russia both have some ways of taking away our space capabilities. Physically, kind of the classical approach is fire a missile at a satellite, very much like an anti-aircraft missile. Going all the way back to the 1960s, the US and the Soviets had some nuclear-armed anti-satellite missiles. We don't do that anymore, but India, China, Russia, and the US have all tested intercepting and destroying satellites in low Earth orbit. China has probably done some tests all the way out to geosynchronous orbit. You can blow up a satellite, and the Russians have actually deployed a system called Noodle. The Chinese probably have as well. We've used standard missiles from Aegis destroyers to shoot down a satellite. One disadvantage is that causes a lot of debris. When a satellite blows up, those thousands of pieces stay in orbit and will gradually spread out, and other satellites might collide with them. When the Russians did an anti-satellite test back in 2021, the astronauts on the space station had to get ready to evacuate on a moment's notice in case a fragment of that debris hit the space station. The Russians did not, by the way, give their own astronauts any warning. It was just as much a surprise to the Russian astronauts as it was to the NASA astronauts. But there's a lot of worry that if you were to blow up a lot of satellites, you would quickly make space unusable for everyone, as more satellites would get destroyed by debris. You'd have a chain reaction, a little like the movie Gravity from about 10 years ago. Wouldn't happen in an hour or two. It would take longer than it did in the movie. But we do worry about this. One other method of physical attack would be, if you can see the satellite here kind of grabbing onto the other satellite. Technically, that's a graphic imagining it's about to refuel that satellite, but it could just as easily do something harmful. And this was imagined many years ago. If anyone remembers the Bond movie, You Only Live Twice, more than 50 years ago, the villain there had built a ship that would go into orbit and would grab US or Soviet space capsules. Well, we pretty much, we're at the point where that's now feasible. And companies in several countries are working on satellites that could grab another satellite and refuel it, push it into a higher orbit so that it can function longer, or deorbit it if it's dead and just a piece of floating space junk. Grab it, slow it down, make it re-enter, get it out of the way. That's great. But if you can do that to a satellite that is dead, you could also do it to a satellite that's still working and that belongs to somebody else. So if that little claw thing were, say, a Chinese or Russian satellite grabbing an American satellite, that could be something that could be pretty bad for us. I show the little space plane in the lower image is the Space Force's X-37B space plane. Looks kind of like the space shuttle. It's quite a bit smaller. You can actually see a person's legs behind it. But it does have a payload bay, might have a mechanical arm like the shuttle did. We don't really know. The Chinese certainly say, hey, how do we know you're not going to use things like this to grab our satellites and steal them? So there's a lot of concern about this new sort of technology where you might be able to slowly grab and break a satellite without exploding it into dangerous fragments. In the other direction, we had mostly thought, well, nobody's going to set off a nuclear weapon in space. We and the Soviets both tried this in the 60s, and what we determined is that nuclear weapons are frighteningly effective against satellites. One nuclear weapon can render disabled or destroyed, satellites thousands of miles away at that moment. And the radioactive particles from the explosion get caught in the Earth's magnetic field and continue to cause a band of radiation that will last for weeks to months. The glowing image you see there is a test we did off of Hawaii. That one test destroyed 1/3 of all satellites that were operating at the time, including the UK's first satellite, including AT&T's first television satellite. Within a couple of weeks, it had destroyed a bunch of the current satellites and would have been enough radiation to be fatal to any astronauts if we had launched a mission at that time. That's from one nuclear weapon. So mostly, we thought most countries decided that's so indiscriminate, it's almost like poisoning a place with chemical weapons. We agreed to that treaty, no nuclear weapons in space. Well, last year, the US intelligence community reported Russia's apparently considering the use of nuclear weapons against satellites. The Russians deny it. I only know what's in the newspapers on this, but we were very, the US administration was very clear that they feel very confident in this intelligence. So if the Russians really are contemplating this, that would be kind of a game changer. Now, it would destroy a lot of Russian satellites too. Where I might worry is Russia just doesn't have as many satellites. Russian space power has really been on the decline. With the sanctions over Ukraine, they really have not been able to keep up their aerospace technology. Maybe Russia is sort of willing to be a spoiler and willing to take space away from the US, from China, from India, from Europe and Japan. I have to assume the Chinese would be pretty unhappy about this because it would kill Chinese astronauts on their space station. It would wipe out Chinese commercial and military satellites. But there is real reason to worry if the Russians are seriously thinking about this. Or what I think is probably the method that is getting the most interest is, how do you make a satellite non-operative? How do you take away its capability without nuking space or blowing up the satellite? And the answer is electronic and cyber warfare. US Space Force has acknowledged it has jamming capabilities, the big antennas there that could be used to overwhelm the uplink to an adversary satellite, presumably. There are a number of cases where we think that's been done to us. We're pretty sure the Russians and the Chinese both have lasers that can be fired at satellites. So if you have an imaging satellite that's trying to optically see what's going on the ground, that laser would blind the camera, even if it's not powerful enough to destroy the satellite. Or cyber attacks. And space tends to be extremely secretive. Cyber tends to be extremely secretive. You mash the two together and a topic you will never read any details about in the open is cyber against satellites. But one has to assume everybody who has an interest in messing with somebody's satellites is interested in offensive and defensive cyber. And that would be a way to potentially take away adversary capabilities without actually making a big mess out of space. So all the evidence that I see on the US side is we particularly want to go think about these non-destructive, how do you take away an adversary's use of a system without some of the downsides? So those are some of the main challenges that we face. What do we do about it? And here I'll just kind of quickly go over some of the main concepts. Probably the number one thing that we're thinking of in the US, resilience is the buzzword that we've settled on. How do you make it so that you're not so vulnerable? The Cold War paradigm was a small number of really big, really expensive satellites that were essentially hand-built, and because they were so expensive, we tended not to build spares, or at least not very many. So if the satellite were blown up, you lose a large share of your capability because you maybe only had 4 or 5 of them to begin with, and you don't have anything ready to launch to replace it. That's a bad place to be. What we're trying to do is things like, what if you have, and here's where the commercial sector has been useful, what if you have hundreds of small satellites so that if you lose one, you lose a fraction of a % of your capability, and you have a warehouse with a couple of dozen spares ready to go. Or relying on more than one type of technology, more than one system, so that if, say, there's a cyber attack that takes out a whole set of satellites, you've also got a different capability from a different supplier that isn't necessarily vulnerable to the exact same cyber attack. Or in some cases, how do we have substitute capabilities on the ground? I don't know details, but I just saw a headline in the last few days about the Army testing out sort of a ground-based GPS where, in the old days, we used to have things like LORAN or other ground-based navigational systems. We're, I think, thinking more about that. Or, they're teaching celestial navigation, getting out the sextants at the Naval Academy again. So being more ready to deal with space disruptions. I don't know that it's a very promising era for diplomacy, but we might try and talk to adversaries. And certainly with the Russian nuclear space capability, I know we have been trying both in conversations with them, or getting the Chinese to talk to the Russians, or working at the UN to try and convince them that really, you don't want to do this. You really don't want to go down this road. Maybe there's some possibility for space arms control. It doesn't seem like a very promising time for it. Or the third option, as we've relied on for so many things, is deterrence, and make clear to adversaries that our space systems are extremely important to us, and if you attack them, we will have ways of retaliating against you. Maybe that means going against their own space systems. Maybe that means retaliating against adversary systems on the ground, adversary targets on the ground. But being better and being ready to hold something at risk that adversaries value if they threaten our space systems. And one way of doing all that has been through the creation of the US Space Force, where 5.5 years ago now, almost 5.5 years ago, we created a brand new service for the first time since the end of World War II, where we stood up, separated mostly from the Air Force, a new space service, precisely on the logic that with space becoming so critical, but also facing more competition, we needed to have a service with domain expertise, where officers and enlisted personnel could really concentrate on becoming space knowledgeable, space minded, that could focus on space bureaucratically. The argument had been that the Air Force, as is true for any large organization, the Air Force focused on pilots and planes and had neglected space. So we created the Space Force, and I hate to anyone who is thinking of transferring, or maybe if you have high school age children who are thinking of joining a service, if they're thinking they're going to get to zoom around in an X-wing fighter, or have a plasma rifle and go fight aliens somewhere, I hate to break it to you, they're a lot more likely to sit in front of a computer in an office building calculating orbits. Space Force has no astronauts. Space Force has no airplane. Space Force, I don't think they yet have any weapons that go boom as opposed to electronic weapons. I mean, their security forces have rifles, of course, but so far they mostly are in the business of preparing to operating and being ready to defend our satellites, possibly conducting offensive operations, and we certainly could start building space weapons. The first couple of years have mostly been getting their feet on the ground, so to speak, but really establishing themselves organizationally. A lot of administrative, bureaucratic details pulling away from the Air Force. So a lot of it has been rebadging. But strategically, they've been particularly emphasizing the resilience angle. They have not been, we got to start blowing up enemy satellites. The focus in the immediate term has been, how do we get better at not being so vulnerable? And really focusing on getting out of that, few, expensive, slow, boutique satellites, and how do we become more like assembly line satellites? How do we leverage what's going on in the commercial sector? And really focusing on how to get better at procuring things fast and procuring things that are going to be less vulnerable. Now, where that might change a little bit with the current administration is there definitely is a sense that they're likely to become more offensive minded. And there's been such politically space weaponization it just sounds bad to people. Like space should be this cool place where we go explore and do neat stuff. Space weaponization has going all the way back to when we created NASA as a civilian organization. We have there's tended to be this sense that we don't like weapons in space very much. This administration seems likely to push Space Force to think a little more offensive-minded, which I think is still likely to mostly mean electronic and cyber more than missiles against satellites. But we may see some change there. The moving towards a national missile defense, the Golden Dome program, that's where I think you really would see space-based weapons. Because in order to really be effective on a global basis, you have to have interceptors against adversary intercontinental missiles based on satellites. That's just going to be more effective. Now, it also risks to be something extremely expensive. We tried this in the 1980s and did some R&D, but it became quickly clear this was a huge problem. Trying to protect ourselves against the whole Soviet arsenal was going to be ruinously expensive. Now, it also was ruinously expensive for the Soviets. I mean, they're the ones who are gone and we're still here, but it was going to be pretty expensive. So we'll see what comes of this. But that Golden Dome program might well call for basing interceptor missiles in space to fire down at adversary ballistic missiles. I also think Space Force is likely to be a relative winner in budget battles. Now, the overall intent is to reduce spending. Relative winner might mean they don't get cut as much as some other places. It seems a little odd to put so much weight on the opinion of one person, but Elon Musk seems to be in the unusual position of being a space CEO and the guy in charge of cutting the budget. So I wouldn't be surprised if space does relatively well within DoD. And frankly, a shift towards SpaceX versus some of the traditional contractors, in part because SpaceX has been delivering some amazing stuff, at good prices and very fast. So I see some potential changes coming there. Say just a little bit about that commercial revolution. In space for many years didn't seem like a lot changed. We were using the same rockets to slightly evolved versions of the same rockets to launch satellites 10 years ago as we had been 30 years ago. That's all changed. And there are now a number of new companies, not only SpaceX. Jeff Bezos has his own space company that has now launched a rocket into orbit successfully. There's a small company called Rocket Lab that has its own rockets, not as big as SpaceX's rockets, but they also have been launching some satellites for customers. Startups in Europe and in China. And beyond rocket launches, a lot happening commercially with satellites, including communications networks. SpaceX has their Starlink network that I believe is now up to about 7,000 satellites, maybe towards 8,000. I'll note, by the way, if any of you have kids, take them out to look at the night sky now, because within 10 years, all you're going to see are satellites. We are headed towards perhaps 100 to 200,000 satellites in orbit if all the current plans pan out. even now, I enjoy doing photography of the night sky. Even now, just 5 years ago, where I would have nothing but a constellation, I'll have a number of streaks through it that are all SpaceX Starlink satellites. It's going to look like you're sitting off the edge of the runways at LAX before long. So, like I said, take your kids out, look at the constellations, remember what it looks like, because it's going to be different in 10 or 20 years. But that also is bringing some pretty amazing capabilities here on Earth, including capabilities very much like military spy satellites. And as just some examples of where this has mattered in Ukraine, one of the very first Russian attacks in Ukraine was a cyber attack on the commercial communication system that Ukraine relied on, called Viasat. Very quickly, Elon Musk and SpaceX were able to get Starlink terminals to Ukraine. They were able to put those in place and recover. Had that not happened, it might have really, that would have contributed very substantially to an early collapse of the Ukrainian military. And both sides have made significant use of satellite intelligence. As one example of the kind of capability that you can get from commercial satellites. This is just before the war started, a U.S. commercial company's radar image at 11 o'clock at night of Russian vehicle columns forming up to move into Ukraine. Again, this is not a military satellite. This is a U.S. company that has a whole constellation of these radar satellites that can see through clouds, see through night, and has been useful to Ukraine. Recent reporting is that we have stopped sharing this kind of commercial information with Ukraine in the last week or so, since the conversation in the White House that didn't go very well. But throughout the war, this has been extremely important to them. I can't resist. I can't resist putting a William Shatner photo up. We are seeing the beginnings of some commercial space travel. The Jeff Bezos rocket that Shatner rode on, it just goes up and right back down, not into orbit. Still, 100 miles up is nothing to, or 100 kilometers up, nothing to sneeze at. There was a fully private orbital flight on a SpaceX capsule a couple of years ago, and notably, the man you see on the far left, Jared Isaacman, is actually the nominee to be the next NASA administrator. Hasn't been confirmed yet, close to Elon Musk, but he was the internet entrepreneur, an aerospace fan who put that together, and he may soon be heading NASA. So going back to where I started on some of the prestige and human spaceflight missions, after many decades of either going in circles on the shuttle and the space station, or really some pretty dry years for the U.S., we actually plan to go back to the moon. The current intent from NASA is to land a crew on the moon in mid-2027. I wouldn't be surprised if that slips again, but we have tested the big new rocket called the exciting name of Space Launch System. Government agency, we're not so good at coming up with cool names. Space Launch System, we did test that 2 years ago and have contracted with SpaceX to use their big Starship rocket as the lander. That's the same one that John mentioned blew up the last 2 times, so we're hoping that gets back on track, because we do need it to work for the moon program. And one thing that's notable in a geopolitical sense is this time where it's very much a program of partnerships. Assuming things continue to go well with Canada, we have promised to have a Canadian on the next flight, which will go around, won't land, but will orbit the moon and come back. We have promised to put European and Japanese astronauts on the moon as part of this, and a number of countries are building hardware to be part of this. It's very much a foreign policy program. It's very much meant to give partner nations something to do with the U.S., to do something that will look cool to their voters, show that their country is engaged in high technology projects. And from a domestic political standpoint, we also have figured it's harder to cancel the program if it's got important foreign policy connections. Now, we'll see what decisions the administration makes, but this is, Artemis is the big NASA program. But we're also not the only game in town. It's not quite the race that it was in the 1960s, but China is also very active. The Chinese do have their own space station now. It's about a quarter the size of the International Space Station that we operate, but that's still, it's larger than I think any of the Russian space stations. They have a very active program of robotic probes like NASA does. They have landed 4 probes on the moon so far. 2 have returned to the Earth with samples of rock from the moon. And China intends to put humans on the moon by 2030. Ambitious, but seems doable. They don't plan quite as giant. The intent for NASA, that giant SpaceX rocket will give us the capability to quickly move towards establishing an actual base, having astronauts on the moon a long time. China's a little more like redoing the Apollo scale mission, but they're gradually advancing their timeline as we keep slowing down. I think it's a real race at this point, whether they get to the moon next or we get to the moon next. We'll always have been first, but next is still bragging rights that matter somewhat internationally. And I'll conclude on this. I think the big question now for the administration is, are we going to change and say, been there, done that with the moon and aim for Mars? Elon Musk is clearly pushing the Trump administration to give up that moon program entirely and aim for Mars. Musk has said that he thinks his Starship rocket would be ready to carry a crew to Mars at the October 2028 launch window. That actually is where astrophysics says you would want to launch. It's conveniently a few weeks before a presidential election too. You could wave goodbye, and if something bad happens, it would happen after the election. So, you could wave goodbye to be cool, and if the life support fails a month or 2 in, I mean, a little cynical there, but seriously, Musk is arguing, been there, done that on the moon. Where humans really have a future is on Mars. It's a whole planet. It's got some atmosphere. It's got lots and lots of water in the form of ice. So if we were to make that choice, that could mean the consequence would be we would almost certainly be guaranteeing that China would be next on the moon, maybe even have a base on the moon while we're still trying to work out travel to Mars. And I don't have any, that's a big bet. Musk would argue being the first nation to really develop Mars is in the long run going to count for more than the moon. In the short run, it could mean we're watching China plant flags on the moon while we're still trying to get a Mars rocket ready. And that could be an uncomfortable position politically for a president. So I'm not sure what to expect there, but it is pretty clear that Musk is trying to argue for this. So we will see where that comes out. I will leave you with this wonderful image this was the test of our new moon ship. Nobody was on board. This was that uncrewed test in 2022. Looking over the far side of the moon to a crescent Earth in the distant. Possibly we'll have some astronauts with that view soon. So thank you very much. I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dave. That was terrific. So much going on that we're all really excited about what the future holds. Questions in the audience? Sir.
Hello, Matt Young. I am an Army senior student, and my question is about the kind of the key real estate in space, the Lagrange points, the geosynchronous orbits. What is competition going to be for those in the future?
Sure. Just to let me back up a second and explain a bit. Space is big, but there are some places in space that are particularly useful. Geosynchronous orbit is that orbit where you're going around the Earth at the same rate the Earth rotates. So, that's where why your TV antenna can point at the same patch of sky constantly. Lagrange points where when a body, if you have a relatively heavy body orbiting an even larger body, like the moon around the Earth, 60 degrees before and behind that object are some points of particular orbital stability and where it takes relatively little energy to change your orbit to either intercept, to go anywhere in the system. It's essentially being at the highest point, it's being at the top of the hill locally. So if you have a spacecraft there, and there have been, both we and the Chinese have done some maneuvers where, if you look at the orbital plot, it's just a spaghetti mess, but where it's because so little energy is needed, you can go all over the place from these spots. So let me start with geosynchronous. That's actually a relatively crowded bit of orbit. There actually is an international agreement through the International Telecommunications Union that allocates spots, almost like allocating, landing spots at a busy airport where you can put satellites. If an adversary were to really target that, or like if you put a satellite in geosynchronous orbit that moved back and forth, targeting other satellites, that would be particularly dangerous. I gather, about a decade ago, the Chinese did what we think was an anti-satellite test, reaching out to geosynchronous distance. Mostly, we and the Soviets had only tested weapons for low-orbiting satellites. They didn't actually blow anything up, but it appeared to be against a virtual target. That was one of the key things that shook Washington up before creating Space Force, that if the Chinese were seriously working on weapons that could attack out at geosynchronous distance, that was stuff like, that's where our missile warning satellites are located, that's where our key command and control satellites for the nuclear systems are located. So we definitely worry about that. And we know both the Chinese and the Russians have had some satellites that have done strange maneuvers in that belt where they will drift and pass by a bunch of the communication satellites. We suspect collecting intelligence on them, maybe taking photographs, trying to intercept their communications links. It's a great place to collect intelligence. So I know we are putting a lot more emphasis on putting capability and just domain awareness out there than we used to. The Lagrange points, like around the moon, that's a little more out there in terms of how useful they'll be soon. And they also, I've occasionally heard them described almost as if it's a key point. Like if I park my spacecraft right here, you can't take advantage. It's a pretty broad, flat top of the hill, to use that analogy. So you wouldn't be able to say, if I can keep you out of a 1 kilometer sphere, you can't take advantage of this special kind of gravity nexus. But I know, again, we know the Chinese have been practicing maneuvers with some of their lunar spacecraft. They have sent communications relay satellites to talk to their probes. And then when the probe on the moon is dead, they've maneuvered that satellite around to kind of moving between the Lagrange points. So the Chinese clearly think it's useful to gain skill maneuvering. That doesn't necessarily mean, it's also useful for scientific probes to be able to save fuel and know how to do maneuvers like that. I know Space Force, you hear increasing talk about cislunar space out to the distance of the moon. So I know we are paying more attention to being able just to monitor things out there, because the radars we use to track satellites in Earth orbit don't really reach that far. So we don't have a good capability. I don't know that we have any evidence that, say, China's tried to hide a satellite out there. We don't have a lot of good capability to know if they have or to see it if they did. So in the near term, I think the big focus for us is we really want to expand our domain awareness capability and just be able to see what's going out there, which is also from the NASA exploration side. NASA's going to need to communicate with and track stuff out there too. So that's actually an area of some synergy between what Space Force and what NASA need. So I realize I'm not sure that was an absolutely direct answer, but I hope that's good. Yeah, please.
I'm Susan Rogers, United States Space Force.
Here.
Here. I started in the Army, so I got in the Space Force through the side window. I have a couple of comments and a question. Number one, going to Mars versus going to the moon. The studies show that getting to Mars is a really long way, and that the Earth's atmosphere will use most of your on-air fuel before you even get past the moon. And so there's a lot of discussion about if you were going to go to Mars, that you would need first to go to the moon to establish a launch from the moon to get to Mars so that you're launching from outside the Earth's atmosphere. So I think that that's something, as a counter-argument, worth looking at. And to your question, the United States Space Force agrees with the overclassification, working very hard for that. My next job is going to be Chief of Fires at Space Command. So the goal is our Five Eyes partners are our closest partners that we work with. And integrating them into all of the things that we do is a big initiative for Space Command and the Space Force. So I just wanted to say those things for your question and to talk about Mars. And is it a good idea? We'd have to go to the moon first.
Yeah, I think moon first makes sense. I think the SpaceX vision is they'll be able to do enough Earth orbit refueling that they won't need to. Although even to get to the moon, I give NASA credit for making the bold step of choosing that very large SpaceX lander. The NASA argument was if we choose sort of an Apollo repeat, and there were some contractors proposing that, we again have, so we have a couple of people go on the moon, they plant a flag, they come home, we've done that. The giant SpaceX thing would give us capability to take a lot of stuff, stay a long time, even if it's overkill to just do an initial landing. But in order to do that, even to get to the moon, the current estimate is they'll need 15 other launches of tanker ships to refuel it to go to the moon. And in-space refueling is not a capability we've ever tried before. So that, again, we really hope that it doesn't blow up next time because it really needs to work. Mars, even more of that. So yeah, it makes sense to me to do both. We also, and the people who really worry about China on the moon say there's a lot of industrial potential on the moon and that it won't just be that China will get all the prestige, but they'll be able to build fuels, they'll be able to build lunar fuel depots that would be useful to them that we really would like too. Or even you can dig up the lunar regolith, the lunar soil, and make building materials out of it. If you want to build giant satellites in Earth orbit, it's plausibly easier to get building materials from the moon to Earth orbit than it is to lift them up all the way from the moon. I'm a little skeptical that, because Jeff Bezos' view is we should turn Earth into a park and have all of our industry in space. That sounds like a nice idea to me. I don't think it's going to happen in a couple of decades the way some of the real advocates do. But there definitely are a lot of people who say there's some really practical stuff you could do on the moon that is going to be a century out if you're trying to do it from Mars. So just as a political scientist and watching the internal politics, if Musk really does convince Trump of this, there are going to be a lot of space security people who I know also are, who really are much more kind of the people the Pentagon talks to, who are going to be pretty unhappy if we were to abandon the moon and say, let China have it. So I'll be interested to see that bureaucratic fight happen because I don't think Musk is going to get 100% buy-in on that.
I'm very pleased to see this young girl in the back of the audience here. Is there anything you would say to her, Dave, if she has a mind that she'd like to get into this business?
Space it's an amazing field. We live in a very small planet in a very big universe. There are going to be things to discover in space for decades to come. So do well in school, stay interested, and whether it's the moon or Mars, there's going to be stuff to do in space to keep people busy for a very long time.
Good advice. Thank you. Anything you'd like to add at the wrap up here, Dave?
I appreciate the questions, appreciate the interest. Those of you watching later on the internet, apologize that I can't take your questions, but I do hope you've enjoyed the presentation. So thank you all, and look forward to seeing the next talks in the series.
Thank you very much. Okay, as a reminder, next Tuesday, the 18th of March, Professor Jim Holmes will be talking about what would Nelson say. Thank you. Good night.